So if you go online and you start reading about compression, probably one of the first things you'll read is that compression reduces dynamic range. And while that's perfectly accurate from an engineering standpoint, it doesn't really tell us a lot about what that means in a musical context. And I think that's why a lot of people struggle with compression. Now, I have to say that while the reduction of dynamic range is perfectly correct as a description, it's only one aspect of what compression does, depending on how technical you want to get about the specifics or the description of that. But it is certainly, from a musical standpoint, I consider it to be only one aspect of what compression does. Now, in order to understand dynamic range reduction, you have to understand what dynamic range is. So what I have here is a drum recording. These are drums I programmed and then I printed it into audio. And as you can see, as we look at this waveform here, we have louder parts and then we have quieter parts. The quiet parts represent the low end of our dynamic range, and the loud parts represent the loudest parts of our dynamic range. And the difference between the quietest and loudest part represents our full dynamic range. So if I take this ball here as an example, these are our loud parts, these are our quietest parts. If we reduce dynamic range, we are going to bring both of those things closer to one another. And that's what it means. Now, you might ask yourself, why on earth would I want to do that? Why would I want to reduce dynamic range? And it's a great question from a musical standpoint. Like I said, dynamic range reduction is only one part of what compression does. But in essence, very shortly describing, when we reduce dynamic range and do this, we are tightening up our performance. We're bringing the louder parts closer to the quieter parts. And it has this tightening effect on our audio. Now, if you're just starting out, you might be tempted to simply slap on a compressor on an audio track. So let's say you have a vocal recording or a drum recording, depending on how good your drummer is. You listen to it and you hear a lot of unevenness. So some parts are way too quiet, some are way too loud. So you might think to yourself, I'll simply slap on a compressor and get a more uniform, even performance. I recommend that you don't do that, for the reason that compression does many other things than simply reduce dynamic range. So instead, briefly touching on that, what I'd recommend is that you edit your audio first, and you use some gain control to do that. So if you're in Pro Tools, you can use clip gain, so you can bring these parts up and you can bring the loud parts down. But that's a topic for a different video. But please don't use compression just to make your performance more uniform. You want to edit the gain of the audio first so that you have a more even platform to do your processing. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play this drum part to you without any processing. So, and what I want you to pay attention to is that it has those quiet notes. These are some ghost notes, and then you have louder stuff like snare hits and kicks. So I'm going to say this again. It can be difficult to show what dynamic range reduction is on its own because compression does so many other things. But what I want you to focus on is how we're bringing those quiet notes closer to the louder ones, and we're kind of tightening things up and making things for more uniform. So because we're reducing dynamic range, usually there's a loss of some volume. So what I've done here is I've tried my best to make these two versions the same level so you can hear them at the same volume and you're not fooled by the volume. And I've done some pretty drastic compression here, but it's simply to kind of accentuate the point of reducing that dynamic range and making the performance more, making it tighter. So I'm gonna start with the compression bypassed, and then I'm gonna bring it in. And I want you to focus on how those quieter notes get closer to the louder ones. So as you can hear, there are many other things happening than just the dynamic range reduction, which is why it's kind of challenging to describe. But a very effective way of realizing what's happening is if you listen to the quiet bits where you mainly hear the reverb of the room, you're just hearing the sound of the room. When we have compression on, a lot of those quiet room sounds are going to be brought up, and we can really hear the air moving, the air sort of moving around, as opposed to the raw recording without any compression. So things like cymbals and reverb decay, those things are brought up. So things like ghost notes and all kinds of quieter stuff is louder. So that's, in short, that's what the dynamic range part of compression is. And in the next video, we're going to go through compression as a movement generator, which is, in my opinion, the biggest part of what compression is about. So this might be kind of difficult to wrap your head around first, but in essence, that's what the concept is. And as you use more compression and play around with these units, you're going to start to understand what that means in a musical context. Finished.